In this video, we will talk about statements, some types of statements, and then we'll look at some examples. Statements are sentences that are either true or false. So let's look at some examples of statements and non-statements. The first example here, a triangle has 4 sides. This is a statement because this is either true or false. And we all know a triangle has 3 sides. So this is a false statement. Next example, open the door. This is not a statement because this is neither true nor false. So this is a non-statement. Next one, capital of United States is Washington, D.C. This is a true statement. If x equals 2, then x squared equals 4. This is another true mathematical statement. Every day in January is cold. Again, this is another statement. It can be true or false depending on where you are located. If you are in somewhere like Australia, this may be false. But if you are somewhere in upper hemisphere, this may be true. So this is also a statement. And the last example here, what time is it now? Again, there is nothing about true or false of this sentence. So this is not a statement. Now let's look at some types of mathematical statements. The first one here we have is universal statement. This statement says a property is true for all members in a set, and it contains words like all, every, or each. The next type is existential. This statement says there exists at least one member in a set for which a property is true. And it contains words like there is or there exists. Another type of statement is conditional. And it says if one property is true, then another property is true. So these are if-then statements. So they contain words like if-then or implies. Now let's look at a few examples. For universal statement, we have this example, all the days in January are cold. So this is talking about all the days in January. So this is a universal statement. For existential, we have a similar example, but this is an existential statement because it says there is a day, there exists a day in January that is cold. So this is existential statement. And let's look at conditional statement. If it rains in January, then it gets cold. So we have if then, so we have a condition. If it rains, then it gets cold. So this is conditional statement. As another example, every positive real number is greater than 0. So it talks about all the positive real numbers. So this is universal statement. Here is another example of existential statement. There is a positive real number that is less than 5. So it says there exists at least one positive real number that is less than 5. And there may be more than one. So all these existential statements say is there is at least one. The next one is conditional. If a number is greater than 0, then it is positive. So here we provide the condition. If a number is greater than 0, then we have the conclusion. So this is an if-then statement, which we call conditional. And we can combine statements to get compound statements. The first one here is universal conditional statements. And in my next videos, I will talk about these in little bit more detail. For now, let's briefly look at how we can combine different statements. The first one here, universal conditional statements. So these are sentences that are combination of both universal and conditional statements. And they contain combinations of phrases like for all for the universal part and if then for the conditional part. Here are a few examples. The first one says for all integers x, if x is divisible by 2, then x is even. This part says universal, and then we have that followed by if then. So we have conditional. So we have universal followed by conditional. So this is universal conditional statement. And next example, for all animals H, if H is a human, then H is a mammal. This one also has a universal part, which is this one, followed by a conditional part, which is that one. So this is also universal conditional statement. Next, we have universal existential statements. These are the statements that have universal part followed by existential part, and they contain combinations of phrases like for all and there exist. So let's look at some examples. The first example here, for all real numbers x, there is a natural number greater than x. So if you look at this one, for all real number x, this is universal part. And then we have that followed by an existential part. There is a natural number greater than x. So that is existential part. Let's look at the next example now. For all students S in a college, there is a faculty that advises S. So this is also an universal existential statement because we have a universal part first. For all students S in a college, that is universal part. And it says there exists a faculty that advises S. That is existential part. Now, next example, every day in January has some snowfall. So this is also universal existential statement. It is written a little bit differently than the first two examples. So we can write this in a way that looks like the first two examples. For all days in January, I can say there is snowfall or some snowfall. So now this one follows the same format as the first two examples. Here, this is the universal part, and this is the existential part. So this is also universal existential statement. Next, we have existential universal statement. These are the statements that have existential part followed by universal part, and they contain phrases like there exist first and then for all. So let's look at some examples again. There is a person in United States, so that would be existential part. And then the second part that is known to every citizen, or every citizen knows that person, is the universal part, because the second part talks about every citizen, so this would be universal part, and the first part talks about there exists, or there is at least one person, so that would be existential part. So this is existential universal statement. The next example, there is a real number x such that every real number is divisible by x. So in this case, the first part is again existential because it talks about how there exists a real number. And the second part is universal because it's talking about every real number that has something to do with x. So we have existential followed by universal. Next example, there exists an integer n such that for every real number x, we have x to n equals x. Again, we have existential part here. There exists an integer n. And then we talk about every real number. then we have every real number x, such that there is some relation between n and x. So this is also existential universal statement, because here we have existential part and then we have universal part.